In today's journey, we are making a WinExpert 1 gallon Cabernet Sauvignon. Although this guide would work for most of the WinExpert 1 gallon red wine kits. Although you should always read the instructions and double check that everything on the supply list is included in your kit before you begin. Even if you've made one before, doesn't hurt to make sure nothing's changed. And lastly, before we get going, we're going to take everything we don't need today and throw it into the box for use later. This keeps everything safe. And the number on the box will be important if you need to contact WinExpert if you have a problem. Oddly, we start with package number 2 and about 1,000 milliliters of hot water. This is bentonite and is important for clarification later. This part is a bit like making gravy, because if you add too much of this at once, it's going to cause clumps and it'll be hard to dissolve. You don't need to use overkill stir plates like we do, but adding it slowly is a necessity. Just like sanitizing anything that's going to come in contact with the soon-to-be wine. We use Star San, and we always keep an ample supply off camera. If you are doing this in a plastic bucket, it is also a good idea to not use any metal tools, as that can scratch the surface, which can harbor bacteria for later batches. Also, when brewing and venting on such small scales, it is important to make sure that you get as much of the ingredients into the vessel as possible, as even the smallest change can have effects to the final product. If metal tools are all you have available to you, just mix the bentonite in a separate vessel first and then add it to the bucket later. As long as everything's sanitized, it shouldn't matter. With the hard part over, we now add the juice to the vessel. And if your cap doesn't come off as easy as ours, our movie magic is to use these pliers to loosen it ahead of time. And for this step, all we have to do is add this to the bentonite mixture and thoroughly mix it. And again, the stir plate is overkill, but it is better than sitting here watching Phil do it by hand. And don't worry about doing it in the most gentle fashion you know, as incorporating some air into the mixture, as it would be good for the yeast to have something to breathe. Just be mindful that adding oxygen at any other point once alcohol is present is bad for the wine. What is good for the wine is to take about a cup of hot water, you could use more but it's not necessary, and to put it into the bag to help get out any of the stubborn bits. As any left behind sugar is wasted potential alcohol that we could have in the final product. Just check out how much the water has changed color by mixing it with the remnants. Although it'd be cool if Phil didn't spill any before he put it in. Although not the pivotal point of making amazing wine, the idea of waste not want not does still apply. With the last of the juice added, we can now move on to topping it off with water. Our target is 1 gallon or 132 fluid ounces. Be sure that you've calibrated your vessel to make sure that you add just the right amount. You may have noticed a black dot floating around on the screen. That is actually our measurement for our vessel. Now we wait as Phil takes the OCD method of making sure that he's hit it just right. This isn't just important for alcohol and body amounts, but also so that we get clarification to work properly as well. This would be the proper time to take a hydrometer reading, but Phil is instead adding the oak, as he will be using a refractometer at the very end, because he forgot to do it now. The trick to adding the oak is that it will naturally want to float, because oak is wood. But the fact that it's floating will get in the way of the yeast getting into solution properly. Two ways you can solve this problem is by giving it a little time to soak up the wine. It'll get heavier and start falling towards the bottom. But also giving it a stir on some of the kits that have a lot of oak that needs to get down lower. Also, Phil's using a metal spoon because we're using glass, and that shouldn't cause any scratching to the vessel. At least no major scratching until he breaks another one. But all kidding aside, if you were doing this in your fermentation vessel and the oak was not getting below the level, just come back in about a half an hour before you put your yeast on there. Now, if we weren't going to record the fermentation process for another video, we would be putting ours into a 2-gallon bucket. For reasons that will become painfully obvious in a couple of moments when we try to use this smaller 1-gallon glass vessel instead. And why we mixed everything in a different vessel first before adding it into here. A common misconception is that these wide-mouthed 1 gallons can be used to do 1-gallon batches for primary fermentation. The problem with that is that they are 1 gallon basically to the rim. A couple of added benefits though is that we're getting a lot of extra oxygen incorporated and getting everything mixed in just one last little bit. The downside is some of the oak stuck to the sides. But as you can see, there's no way all of this is fitting in there while leaving at least a little room for the yeast krausen to expand. It looks worse than it actually is, and we do have a plan to solve it. As conveniently, Phil comes armed with a funnel and a bottle. A normal person would just split off a little bit of the yeast that we would be pitching into the larger vessel and put it into here, but instead Phil decides to experiment by putting some Safale 05 into it instead. I'm sure it'll come out great. Of course, if you use the proper 2-gallon plastic bucket, this becomes a complete non-issue. For the final 2 steps, we just need to pitch the yeast and put the fermentation vessel into a good fermentation temperature. And we would like our wine must to be at the temperature of fermentation before actually pitching the yeast, which is about 72 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. And normally a dark place. However, we will be recording ours, so it'll be under the studio lights for the next 15 days. At which point we'll be ready to move on to phase 2, stabilizing and clearing. Don't forget that we're here to help, so give a comment below if you're having any trouble. And until the next phase is ready, check out some of our other videos here. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to continue to see what we have cooking next. Is it wine yet?